Welcome back to another reading and correcting of Stepping Up by me, Kindar, the Tiger Writes, and Ty, the Tiger Supervisor. Today we are doing Chapter 2. Tibs paid attention again to how the essence stretched from the city he came from to his town, then snapped out of existence. He opened his eyes to the late afternoon sky over Craggle Rock. Nothing had changed. Since the town had nothing had changed since the town. 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 It feels like there's a comma there, but when nothing had changed since the town. Nothing had changed since the town had shut down along with the dungeon. Unlike when Stowe graduated, there was no work being done to expand. No one but him knew. Stowe was alive and healing. The guild suspected he was. Alistair had mentioned that dungeons were resilient, but without his ability to speak with him, it was more akin to hope than anything else. And that was more than the townsfolk even had. The board guard leaning against the pillar at the bottom of the step watched Tibs. He didn't stop him or demand to see the bracelet on his left wrist. Tibs didn't bother offering it as he passed by. He'd decided after the first few times back that it wasn't his job to confirm he belonged here. The lack of reaction did tell him there was no indication Stowe was about to open his door. A dog fell into step as he turned onto Dungeon Road, which would take him out of the town to the plain separating it from the mountain that was where Stowe existed. The dog was large, with short, sandy fur, and looked at him plaintively, licking its muzzle. You know, Sir Bites, it when I give these to you, right? Tibs pulled a piece of jerky from a pocket and handed it to the dog. Where is she, anyway? Thump was too busy chewing to acknowledge the question. He looked around. She should have been berating the dog for interacting with Tibs. When he looked at Thump again, he was looking back, a miserable expression on his face. With an amused shake of his head, Tibs gave him another piece. The road was deserted. Without access to the dungeon, the nobles had left. The town, like Craggle Rock, held no other appeal to them, and Tibs was grateful for it. No appeal to them. Tibs was grateful for it, but without their coin, this is why you want to do more than use Grammarly, ProWriting, and other program for editing, because they will miss very basic stuff that something as simple as a reading out loud will catch. All but the most basic of merchant had also left, which meant that anyone who could afford the cost was elsewhere. Hope in still reopening his door wasn't enough to keep people who could leave here. The town wasn't empty. There were the attendants. The guild still had a presence in the form of the guards, and enough people couldn't afford to leave. And enough people simply couldn't afford to leave. There were taverns still open, but there wasn't much else of life that had. There wasn't much of the sense of life that had filled the town before. Those left lived with the fear of the town outright dying without a dungeon to bring people to it, and what would happen to them. They had been brought by the guild and a promise of a better life if they helped build the town, and they'd build the town, and feel like it's the start of a new phrase. And while as far as Tibs could tell, they weren't indentured to the guild the way he was. They hadn't been promised a way to leave should things not work out. More a lack of belief the town would fail on the part of the guild than maliciousness. Dungeons always meant success, and the stories of a dungeon dying were so rare, Tibs couldn't find anyone, not even Karina, who had heard one. Stowe wasn't one of those, but only he knew that for certain. The whistle sounded, and Thump ran off to answer it. Not long after that, the road left the town, turning into a well-trod path, winding down to what had become known as the Gathering Field, where Omega-grade runners assembled while waiting to be assigned to a team for their runs. There were no more guards running into town looking for a free fighter or archer or sorcerer. If they weren't on the field, they weren't going to run. And since the Omega runners who had come after Stowe graduated and paid for the privilege, they had all spent their time there. Here. There. Enough. Okay, you know what, just... is that... You know what? A handful of merchant had even booths there. A handful of merchant had even set a booth there, selling food and drinks as well as cheap equipment. Unlike the group Tibs had arrived with, these could be expected to have coins even before their first run. Tibs remembered the first time he'd seen a whole copper coin. The awe it had been that it had been intact, that he could tell what the design on it was instead of having to guess from the sliver he'd held before. Tibs hadn't even held a half copper before he'd picked up a full one in the dungeon, or when he'd received the first copper coin he'd been allowed to keep, although that memory was tainted by who had handed it to him. Bardic had still been on the table, smiles and nicknames at the ready. Bardic, who had taught Tibs to fight knives. Bardic, who had involved Tibs in a plot to kill the dungeon without his knowledge. Bardic, who had nearly succeeded in killing Stowe and was responsible for the constant ache deep inside Tibs. He tried to see the adventurer rogue between his trips to locate the city Tibs came from, but Tibs tried to see the adventurer rogue between his trip to locate the city he came from, but no one he'd ask would tell him where the prison Bardic was kept in was. All he found out was that it was the most terrible place the guild had. Tyrannia had been the most patient with him, listening to Tibs explaining how he needed to find out from the adventurer how he could betray the guild in the dungeon, how he could betray Tibs when he thought they could be friends. She nodded in understanding and told him there was nothing she could do or would do, or nothing she could or would do about it. Bardic would never leave that prison, and no one, not even Tibs, would ever go there to visit him. When she'd explain that some people were never satisfied with what they had, that some needed to destroy when they couldn't have or control what they couldn't. What? They couldn't have or control. That some simply hated what was different. Tibs had stopped listening. He knew the why of Bardic's action. The man had thought destroying the dungeon would lead to the guild losing its hold on the town and the runners here. Tibs hadn't realized he'd still hoped the two of them could be friends until the pain of the betrayal had hit. The one thing he couldn't explain, that he wanted to know from the adventurer, was why he hadn't told anyone about how Tibs had drained his essence until he looked older than Alistair. Tyrannia and those from the guild who knew more about dungeons said it. Tyrannia and those from the guild who knew more about dungeons said it had been some defense, an attempt at stopping him, but they were guessing. Tibs knew that. For as much as people claimed to know about the dungeons, he'd learned there was much more they didn't. Bardic could have enacted his revenge against him by telling them he was responsible, by revealing one of his secrets. He paused at the bottom of the steps leading up to the hill that ended where the door to the dungeon was. They were different from when they'd first appeared, after Stowe graduated, or even from the last time Tibs visited. They had been rough then. Now they were polished and had designs. Do you like them? Stowe asked. He looked up at them, then continued the motion by turning and taking in the empty field and path leading back to town. He confirmed he was alone and looked back at the dungeon. Did you have to make them rats? He indicated the designs. That he intended for it or not, still had given Tibs a hatred of all rat-related things. You sound better, he added, walking up the steps. Too many of them had designs of rat running along the edge. It's good for the new runners to know what to expect. On the fifth one, the rats were replaced by ratlings, and instead of running, those humanoid creations were killing people. He shuddered at the memory of having one of those on his back, claws coming for his face. How's Genny? Tib started up again. Genny's not well. Nearly losing me did something. I don't understand most of the explanations. It seemed pretty simple to me. If I die, there's another dungeon to be helped. Losing someone isn't that simple, especially if they care about you. You saw how Walter's death hurt me. You understand that, since it's the reason you gave me the pouch and belt. But you're human. Genny isn't. Neither am I. I'm not saying this to be mean, Tibs, but when you die, I'll go on. He nodded. It was why dungeons existed, after all. Push the people exploring them so they became stronger, if they survived. Tibs didn't want to die, but he had no illusion about his chances. With his weak essence and the fact he couldn't ask for help in training any but water, it was only a matter of time until Stowe put an obstacle before him Tibs wouldn't be able to overcome. If he could tell someone at the guild about his multiple essences, it might help him. But more likely, since that was supposed to be impossible, they'd want to study him, find out how to get someone else to have the same. They'd never let him go. And his one element he had, and the one element he had more essence with the one element he had more essence than he knew what to do with didn't exist, or at least Kirino had never heard of anyone with one that let them sense the essence coursing through other people, or use it to heal injuries after a fashion, or as Jekyll liked to call it, splinting the injuries until a cleric could heal them. Maybe her people are more like humans than they are like you. The slab of stone blocking the entrance to the dungeon was still featureless, but the columns on each side and above were more elaborate now. Instead of just rats or bunnies, there was now a sense of each of the rooms in the first floor. There was a fighter skewered by a spear between walls, boulders with a leg and an arm being nibbled on rats. On the other column, the boulder scene was different. The runner standing with a rat on top and, "Is that me?" Tibs demanded. The rogue was on the small side, thin, holding a knife. "No." Still sounded offended. "It's just a random rogue." Actually, these are no longer capitalized. They're the ones usually panicking among the boulders the first time they see rats. "I didn't panic," Tibs stated, trying to stop the shudder at the memory of standing there, frozen in fear. A rat glaring at him from the top of a boulder. Another showed a bunny launching itself as a sorcerer from a hidden door on the floor, the warren room. The next one he identified was the boss room, the golem breaking an archer into two with its whip hand. "Did you make all of these?" "Of course. Did you think there was another dungeon in here, hiding in the drawings when I wasn't looking?" Tib studied the trap room. This one, a sorceress raised off the floor by an angled spear. He could make out the marks that had identified which of the tiles were triggers when it had first gone through. "You're good." It was an easy admission. As unnerving as seeing the scenes he'd almost died in was, the skill needed to draw them wasn't undeniable. "Thanks." Tib sat his back to the door. "Do you know when you'll be opening?" The answer took time in coming. "Soon. Everything looks right, but the corruption seeped in deep. I'm not finished cleaning it out." Tibs raised an arm, feeling the ache with emotion. "How are you removing it? I thought corruption just destroyed everything it touched." "It's within me, Tibs, and I control anything that isn't alive inside me. If I'd known to expect an attack like that, I would have been ready for it." He paused. His voice was subdued when he continued. "I thought nothing could hurt me. The stone I make is supposed to be impervious to anything." Tibs chuckled. "The creatures aren't all that hard. The creatures aren't all that hard. Slice the rat into two with a dull knife. That's because I make them that way. Hard enough to be a challenge, tough enough to kill you if you aren't paying attention. You had it made the loss you'd experienced vanished, but learning that still didn't exist simply to feed off the people who died within his wall had softened it. His purpose was to force them to improve, to get better and stronger. The guild had told them that surviving the dungeon would cause that for them, but they believed it was the secondary effect they were taking advantage of, not the reason dungeons existed. It was one of those things the guild had wrong about dungeons, one of many. Wait, what? As the guild, as far, wow, how did I go from meaning far to after? As far as the guild was concerned, dungeons were nothing more than cunning animals. So, soon, it's going to be a question. I can't give you anything better, Tibs. You know time isn't something I understand the way the living do. I should tell them to set up a schedule here. That way you'd see how we separate the days into 5 weeks of 9 for each month, then the season. It helped me figure out how it helped me figure it out. With my team's help. How are they? They haven't visited. You sounded disappointed. Jack goes with Crowseth in Mountain Sea. Karina travels, looking for books to read, but she stops to see them. Mez is with his family. Last time I saw him, he said something about his mother trying to convince the guild he didn't belong there. Not as a runner, anyway. He hadn't done anything deserving. He hadn't done anything deserving of that fate. Tibs rubbed his wrist, as if picking a pocket to survive had been a crime so grave he'd deserve to end up here or get his hand cut off, which had been the alternative. Those who made the laws didn't care how it affected those under it. He'd been caught, so he needed to be punished. Reasons why he'd been forced to do it could go to the abyss. And the cleric? No one since Kumdar, since Harry kicked him out. Since Harry kicked all the runners out. He tried to stay and look after me, but there was an argument with the purity cleric in charge, and he got banned from the guild house. If he couldn't look after me, he had no reason to stay. Is the consensus. Do you think he'll come back? Tibs ran a hand over the bracelet on his left wrist, with the yellow gem in it. If he wants to live, he'll have to. If he was still alive. Unlike Tibs and any of the original runners, Kumdar hadn't come here from a cell. He'd arrived after Stowe graduated, which meant he'd paid to come, or someone had paid for him. He'd mentioned his choice had been here, or to be killed, but it hadn't been by guards. Would whoever had sent him here appreciate he was free? The bracelet allowed a runner to go anywhere they wanted, but all it took was one person to realize who you were, and all your enemies could find out. They paid to send him here, so they had the coins to follow him through the transportation platform. It was one thing Tibs had learned but from asking questions the attendant. The person who took you to your destination could always get back there, even if they weren't the one who set the destination, such as when Alistair had taken Tibs to the cavern where he'd had his audience with water. Even if that attendant had never been there before, afterward, they knew the way because they felt how the essence had been shaped by the platform and could recreate it. They were there to provide the void essence that allowed the platform to work, which was why they needed to accompany even those able to set the destination themselves. The platform and pillars acted as controls anyone with essence could interact with. They haven't been back because they can't. Not until the gem in the bracelet turns red. I get special treatment because I saved you. Your team helped. Jekyll took on one of the adventurers that tried to chase you. He was taken down quickly, but it gave you more of a lead. Maz let out a bunch of arrows. Really like that. He really liked his bow. Tibs chuckled. It was a lucky one. It was lucky one of the chests had something so well suited to him. It was, wasn't it? He lowered his voice. I don't think Annie's going to believe it was random if it happens again. I don't think it will. Tibs stood. Tell her I'm looking forward to seeing what she did with the third level. How about you start by going through the second floor first? I will. I'm not letting you eat me on your second floor. Knowing it would happen eventually didn't mean Tibbs had to make it easy. You aren't eating me if I can avoid it. I'm glad. I'm glad, Tibbs. Back into town, the weaver was at his loom this time, working under the awning. Gone to see the dungeon again? He asked. I don't want him to get too lonely, Tibbs replied, and the weaver chuckled. They knew the stories of how dungeons were nothing more than animal, but unlike the guild, they thought even animals deserved compassion. Or they simply indulged Tibbs because he was the youngest runner and still alive, and he'd saved the dungeon and indirectly the town. He was allowed his strangeness because of that. I hope it's not going to last too long, the man said. There's no point coming in with all the runners away. And soon, there's no point coming in with all the runners away. And soon, I'm not going to be able to pay the rent to the guild anymore. Another reason the townsfolk spirits fell, most of them had come with the guild and promises of property and opportunity, and technically, Tibbs hated that word, they had that. Only it came with a price. The guild hadn't given them the land or the building they lived in to use for their business. They leased it to them. The guild only cared about them so long as they could pay for it. Tibbs didn't know what would happen to them once they couldn't pay. It wasn't like the guild would pay for them to leave via the platform. Was this how a city gained the street? Soon, he answered, putting as much confidence in his voice. Putting confidence in his voice. Soon, we're going to come back, I promise. And this concludes Chapter 2 of Stepping Up. If you're enjoying this, please hit the like button, subscribe, share with your friends. If you want to read this, it's available on my Patreon. This is posted at the same time as on Royal Road, but if you're just joining this, you can go to Royal Road and catch up to or read ahead. The link is in the notes, and as well as my Patreon. And if you want to listen to me read this live, the link to my Twitch is in the notes also, and you can watch me write that story and more. And with that, I shall wish you a good day.